Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV, where I'm absolutely privileged to be joined again by the great Mark Gatiss. How are you, Mark?
I'm good, thank you. Yes, you joined me from Professor Quatermaster's laboratory.
Fantastic.
It should really be Unit HQ, but these background stills are they're actual production stills, and they're so beautiful. I just can't resist them now.
No, I mean that is a particularly lovely one as well. Yeah. Whereas I have my Nick Landau sanctioned Forbidden Planet wallpaper.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure you're very envious of.
Definitely. I like the rocket very much.
Yeah, the rocket's awesome. A rocket as designed by Ryan Hughes, if you're familiar with his work.
Yeah.
My former housemate, in fact.
Really?
Yeah, in a kind of 6 degrees of 7 degrees of 7 bacon kind of way, whatever it is. Yeah, so
it's a small world.
Yeah, it is a small world indeed, but that is a killer background you've got. I'm very envious. And we're here today to talk about the lovely Target paperback release of your Crimson Horror adaptation.
Yes.
So the way I'd like to get into that, which is part of a beautiful set that we're doing a whole series on here at Forbidden Planet TV, which is coming out this month. But Mark, what was your first experience of Doctor Who?
It's Spearhead from Space, John Pertwee's first story. That's what I remember very, very vividly. Sitting, 2 foot away from the telly, and the Autons coming through the shop window, not quite the way you remember. Yeah. But I have weird kind of folk memories of things like it's absolutely true. My family used to do impersonations of the fish people from the Underwater Menace because they found them so funny. I remember that being very current. I can see my mum now kind of doing that. And I think somewhere from being like 3 or something, I remember when the Radio Times 10th anniversary special came out, the best day there's ever been in history.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing a photo.
I remember that so clearly myself. It was amazing.
I remember seeing a photograph of the white robots from the Mind Robber, and I can remember thinking I'd seen them. So there's a possibility, because you forget all those things when you're that age, but I might have seen it before John Pertwee. But that's definitely my first proper memory, is that, and that whole first season, I have very specific stabs of the Ambassadors of Death and the Primord on the gasometer. I had a childhood terror of gasometers. Yeah. Because of it, and because I'm from the northeast, there were a lot of them. I can remember driving, to my auntie and uncle's house on a Sunday, and we'd always pass these gasometers, and they frightened me because of that. But the big one was the Auton, the dummies coming to life, because that was a real thing, And March the Tailor in Newton Aycliffe Parade, I can remember literally clutching my mother's skirts in terror when we passed the mannequins as a result. So that was my beginning. And then the first target I got was the 3 Doctors.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic! And
I guess so. I was unaware that there'd been 3 published in the 60s and then reissued. What I can remember so vividly, I bought it from Strike's Garden Centre in Darlington, and there was a wall of them. It was like a section. And I chose the 3 Doctors. It seemed the logical one to start with. And while my parents went around the garden centre, I sat in the back of the car, and I think I read the whole thing actually before they came back. And then Doctor Who and the Daleks. And then it just went from there. But I decided to start with that because obviously I remembered the story. It was very recent, and also it had 3 Doctors, and it had that amazing cover and everything go for it. It's still such a special story to me. That really is so special.
I would think it's the classic thing, isn't it? Those first ones that you get back in that era. So we both grew up in you only got one shot at seeing things on TV. Yeah. And then it was like, man, I'd read about the Hartnell and Troughton episodes and think, and I'd go through that Radio Times special and go, man, I wish I'd seen this. I wish I'd seen this. And it was the only way you could communicate with those.
What's incredible though is it felt like ancient history, and it was even because the pictures were in sepia or green tinged, and they were like 2 or 3 years before. And now, because we're old, the gap, we're not far off the 60th anniversary already. And that 10-year span is, when you're a child, is immense. And so,
yes,
and yet,
absolutely.
if you were to do the Radio Times special today, you'd have pictures from David and Matt's era, which would be the equivalent of, Hartnell and Troughton. It seems incredible, doesn't it?
I mean, I think a big thing is it's the flip from black and white to color, right?
Yes,
and actually the technology was constantly evolving at that point. So I guess it was really looking back into it. If you just said, "Oh, it was only the other day," it felt like a whole other era.
But it's also because it's so inaccessible, whereas things are much more accessible now. So I can remember being a little frightened of Hartnell's face on Doctor Who and the Daleks, and particularly the interior illustrations, because they were so they were like etchings, where there was something harsh about them and very otherworldly. And that was because it felt like an impossibly distant past where the Doctor was someone else, and magic, really. But it's an indefinable thing to do with inaccessibility, whereas now obviously you can, if you wanted, if you just watched Jodie for the first time and somebody said there are other Doctor Who, you can go on BritBox or iPlayer and watch most of them, and that's a different world, really.
It's so true. I mean, I've got 2 adult kids, and they've grown up in a world where the quest for information doesn't exist. So I was a fan of the American pulp magazines, Shadow and Doc Savage, from the age of about 10. But it probably took me 15 years to complete my knowledge of how they had come about, what the actual stories were, how they were published. Was it a radio show? Was it a pulp? It was totally opaque and unclear to me for years. And of course now, the whole British Library is just at your fingertips. It's a massively different world.
But it's good and bad, isn't it? The truth, you don't want to sound like an old fossil, because of course that is exactly the sort of accessibility we all craved. But there is also the magical quality of having to work for it, or of things being sort of slightly out of your reach. There's something intangibly beautiful about that. It's that one visit to the library.
Yeah.
Where everything, which unlocks everything.
It's so true. So true. I grew up in Merseyside, and my grandparents used to take me on a twice-a-year pilgrimage to Keighley in Yorkshire, because there was a comic shop there. And finding comic shops in the north of England, we had 2 in Liverpool, but it was difficult, and they all had different things in them. To me, there's no way of knowing that, and that journey, that's a glorious part of accumulating that information and knowledge.
Yeah. Similarly, and with targets, there was some in some places, and I used to go to Dressers, Darlington High Street, and Binns, House of Fraser. They had different ones, and I've now got this handy wall chart from Doctor Who magazine, which has them all on. And I was going through, looking at them, thinking, certainly the early ones, they all have stories for me, not just the TV stories. My mum went on a shopping trip to Leeds, and with the specific request to get me the Auton Invasion. And I can remember when she came back, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang was on. And I remember the incredible excitement when, she came back literally in the fairground scene with Arthur Mullard and Barbara Windsor. I heard the door go. She came back, she had a little brown, because I couldn't get it for some reason, where I had to send her on a special mission, and things like that. And I can remember racing to finish the Demons so I could start The Abominable Snowmen, which remains one of my absolute favorites. And it's weirdly intrinsically caught up in the cold blue spine and everything about that story I absolutely adore. And in that funny way, despite John Pertwee being my doctor, I was obsessed with Troughton, because it felt so nearly there. And I loved the whole, all the differences. I love the fact he was a funny little man, Yeah. Gosh, yes, they've got these early ones, the yellow of Carnival of Monsters, and yes, it's amazing. It's properly Proustian.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
100% is. It's that flood of memory around the experience of the book that I think you've gone into it in a really interesting way, because it's just that's my experience of it. It's everything around the book and getting hold of procuring the book. It's not just the book itself, it's where you read it. And it's like classic episodes of Doctor Who. I'm sure it's the same. I always remember where I was when I saw them. Yeah. And on that note, do you have a complete collection of targets?
No, I don't have a complete collection. It can't be far off. It's funny, this resurgence has meant, I think what I'm going to do, they're on the loft. It's just space, really. But I think what I might do is bring down the initial set, because I'm so fond of, they are like I could imagine that sort of, boom, that on a shelf. Because I mean, the thing is, as with being a Doctor Who fan, you go through different stages. So I can remember when I became a real fanboy, and that stage where you start to become slightly embarrassed about loving a children's program and you wanted to change. So I was very into like the novelizations of Logopolis and Castrovalva and some of the more complicated ones and recent ones. I love that. And then I also remember, this is absolutely true, it's ridiculous. I remember I stopped buying them for a while because I was a bit embarrassed, but I allowed myself to buy books about the earlier Doctors because that felt like it was some sort of historical research. So I wouldn't buy The Power of Kroll, but I would buy the War Games because that was like archival, you know. Nuts. And then I remember when I was about 14 or 15, really, I just spend everything I had catching up because I had these huge gaps, you know. And then there was this other phase, which was really interesting, when they started, Terrance Dicks had his amazing Renaissance, doing the earlier Pertwees particularly, and then they also started getting the original writers back. And I found that, I think we all did, was an amazingly fertile period. It didn't always work, but like the rediscovery that Donald Cotton was a stone cold fucking comic genius was something else. And that, The Mythmakers particularly, it's such a good book. And I remember thinking, it was joyous that. It was joyous. And although Terrance had this fantastic run of just doing all of them, and obviously having to do very short versions just to cope with it. But the idea of I just love that idea that someone like Donald Cotton or John Lucarotti on his boat off the coast of Greece would get a telex saying, and they just kind of go, oh yes, why not? And there's something beautiful about that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's as good a point as any to ask you about the genesis of your novelization, The Crimson Horror. How did that come about, Mark?
Well, Albert De Petrillo at BBC Books asked me a good while ago, I mean about 4 or 5 years ago, before the targets were conceived, about doing it as a one-off. I'm not quite sure why, but I didn't have time. I thought I'd love to. But then actually when the whole range sort of restarted, he asked again, and I said, well, and it was just perfect timing, really. And so that's the one we went for. I mean, it's one of my favorites, and I really enjoyed it. And there's obviously it's a two-part thing. Partly it's the nostalgia of having a Target book with your name on it and a Chris Achilleos type cover by Anthony Dry, but it's also just the joy of doing that. I mean, in a way, I got that telex on my yacht off the coast of Greece. We're asking you to revisit your old script, and it's not that long ago, but it is already a different era, and it was really nice to do that. And I went back to a couple of early drafts and tried to find a few bits that were left out or we changed our minds about. And then the big thing was, and really just coming off the back of doing Dracula with Stephen, and because it's a Victorian novel, I wanted to write it like Dracula, from different people's points of view, phonograph records, diaries, things like that.
Give it that epistolary vibe.
Yes, that was immediately appealing. And I had such a good laugh with it, you know. So most of it is narrated by Jenny because she's the sort of So she becomes like the Watson, and then there's bits from Strax, which were great fun. I did a whole chapter from the Doctor's point of view and one from Ada Gilliflower, and it was great fun. But the main thing was, because one of the things I love about the episode is that it's like a comic, really. It moved very, very quickly, and I didn't want to sort of expand it so much that it sort of lost its pace. So I decided to start it with a prequel adventure. So it has Vastra and Jenny's first encounter with the Doctor is a whole different story as a kind of prequel to it all. And that way I could keep the main events of the Crimson Horror quite tight.
Yeah. What a lovely opportunity. How does it feel for those characters to have taken on the life of their own that they have, and to have become so beloved of Who fandom?
Well, it's delightful, obviously, but it owes so much to the legacy of Target, and particularly Terrance Dicks, that has happened, that you find yourself thinking about how to flesh them out and do what those books did so beautifully, when you would, a character like Mr. Ollis in the Three Doctors, who obviously has very little screen time, but Terrance was able to make him live and breathe and give. And the one I really remember is in The Green Death, which Malcolm Hulke novelized, and he didn't write the story, but he really does. He goes to work on. There's a brilliant stuff about a security guard who's obsessed with horror comics. Do you remember?
Yes, absolutely. And yeah,
it's really good. And it has that thing which everyone always talks about, like, the guy, the Scotsman with the hangover at the beginning of Invasion of the Dinosaurs, lived and breathed for me. And then when I saw it again and he's not in, you feel desperately disappointed, because what they had done was really make the range live and find a way of, So yeah, feeling you can do that with Vastra and Jenny, Strax, whatever, and the Doctor and Clara, and making them live on the page, And then obviously you have that. I've managed to smuggle in a little, there's a reference to the Great Intelligence. And then there's an asterisk. It says, "See Doctor Who the Snowman." I mean, that made me so happy.
That's brilliant.
And it even has a changing face thing at the beginning, which I was thrilled by that.
I can absolutely see why. It's those Easter eggs are just pure joy, I think. That's wonderful.
I think my favorite bit is that when in the Doctor's chapter, he says capacious, and then it just says, "What a lovely word. I wonder where I got that from."
Well, on that note, this has been Mark Gatiss telling me all about the genesis of his beautiful Crimson Horror novel from Target, which you can order from the links attached to this video, along with all of the other Target novels that are releasing this month. Thanks for finding the time to talk to me today, Mark. It's great to see you again.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. All the best. Bye-bye. If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV, and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.